Hey everyone, welcome to Sweets TNT. In our last episode, we spoke about the Amerindians, the first people of Trinidad and Tobago. They lived in TNT at least as far back as 7,000 years ago, and for a long while, they were the only ones living here. Until one momentous day in history when the second people arrived. So, who were these people? From where did they come? Why did they come? Well, this is the story we're gonna tell in episode 2, The Age of Exploration. So picture this. Meanwhile, the Amerindians occupy our beautiful Caribbean. Time is flying by. Decades and centuries are passing, and changes are occurring in other parts of the world. Civilizations develop, great empires rise and fall, and many wars are fought. Eventually, nations begin to rise in power. All throughout this time, though, something called trade is growing more and more important. Trade is when you exchange goods and services with someone else for goods and services. Purchasing and selling goods and services for money is also trade. And by the 15th century, trade markets and trade fairs were well established. Also by the 15th century, the people of Europe acquired a huge taste for Asian goods, their spices in particular. They were desperate to get their hands on Asian spices. Here's our spice map that represents a map of the world in the 15th century. We have China, India, and Arabia, which represents Asia. We have Africa and Europe. Europeans were going crazy for spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, pepper, clove, and turmeric, as well as other Asian goods like tea, silk, cotton, and porcelain. Okay, so I know it might seem strange to you now that all this fuss was being made off of things like spices and silk, but what you need to keep in mind is at this point in time in history, roughly about 600 years ago, these were brand new things to Europeans. These spices did not grow in Europe, and it revolutionized their diets. It made their food less boring and a lot tastier. Think about it. We as Trinbagonians love our food, and that's just because it tastes so good. But imagine if we were limited to cooking everything without our spices, without our seasoning. No pepper, no shadow benny, no ginger. It wouldn't taste so good, would it? Nope. So 600 years ago in Europe, spices were rare and expensive. Sacks of spices were required for royal banquets and weddings. Spices were burnt to mask bad scents. It was even used as medicine. Like cinnamon was used to help curb fevers. Other Asian goods like silk was used to clothe nobles and royalty. Fashion was a big deal back then. Even porcelain was used to help serve food. All of this to say, selling these Asian goods in the European markets was very profitable, and trade with Asia represented an enormous opportunity for great wealth. But Europe had one problem. There was only one main route that they could use to get to Asia, the Silk Road. Here we see the Silk Road in yellow. Now, the Silk Road wasn't really just one road, but more of a collection of routes that connected Europe with Asia. It was established by the Chinese, and it was one of the first trading routes that connected the quote-unquote two worlds. The Silk Road played a significant role in the development of what we would now call international trade. The problem with the Silk Road, though, was that it was very long, and traveling along it was very slow, expensive, and quite dangerous. Persons traveling with goods faced ambushes from robbers, and they were subjected to large taxes from Arab middlemen. Because of this, Europeans wanted to find a new route to Asia, by sea rather than by land, so that they could trade directly with Asia. The search to find this new route is what led to an era in history called the Age of Exploration, which roughly lasted from the 15th century to the 17th century, which is the year 1400 to the year 1699. And during this time, European nations were competing to see who could find the sea route to Asia first, so that they could control the spice trade. Okay, so you could tell by now that things today are very different from how they were back then. For one, we have globes and maps that show where all the countries and lands are. Back then, however, a large portion of the world was unmapped. Geographers and explorers had theories about where lands were and where you should travel to reach certain places, but they weren't sure, and so they needed to explore. Leaders of nations sponsored voyages, and explorers embarked on dangerous journeys sailing through unknown areas with the hopes of making great discoveries in the name of their country. Finding the sea route to Asia meant fame and glory, and they would receive great wealth and nobility when they returned home. So, who was winning so far? One could say Portugal was winning. They had skilled navigators, shipbuilders, and knowledge of geography. At the time, they even had an advanced ship called the Caravel. The Portuguese were convinced that you could get to Asia by sailing around Africa. And in fact, infamous Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, financed many expeditions to find the sea routes. Meanwhile, other nations and explorers were eager to do the same thing. Christopher Columbus was one of these explorers, and he had a different idea about how you could reach Asia. Christopher figured instead of sailing around Africa, you could sail west across the Atlantic. If the Earth was round, you could sail west around the Earth and end up reaching Asia from this side. He had one problem though. He needed someone to finance his voyage. He reached out to Portugal and they said no. England also said no. Do you know who ended up paying for Christopher Columbus's voyage? If you said Spain, you're absolutely correct. Okay, so another thing that was different back then to today is that a lot of the countries and nations we know now had not yet formed or united. This was also true for Spain. But in 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand finally defeated the Moors in Granada, which was located to the south of their kingdoms, and they united Granada with Aragon and Castile to form the country we know today as Spain. It was on the heels of this victory they also agreed to finance Columbus's voyage. Spain was competing with Portugal and they wanted to win, so they struck a deal with Columbus. They promised that he could keep 10% of whatever riches he found, along with noble title and governorship of any new lands he should encounter. This sounded like a sweet deal to Christopher, who was very much interested in fame and glory. And so, in 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail west across the Atlantic with the infamous Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria in the hopes of finding his sea route to Asia and discovering new lands. Instead, he discovered the New World. Vast lands that were unknown to people from the Old World. As you can tell, the Caribbean is also part of the New World. In fact, Columbus and his crew found themselves in the Bahamas on an island that they named San Salvador. Convinced he found the Indies, as Asia was then known, he sailed from island to island in the Caribbean for months, until 1493, when he departed the island of Hispaniola, today we know it as Dominican Republic and Haiti, leaving behind some men from his crew to set up a colony, and he returned to Spain. In Spain, he received a grand welcome from the Queen and King, despite not reaching Asia. He brought back small amounts of gold, spices, native birds, and human captives. In the minds of Europeans, Columbus had discovered the New World, and this pretty much changed everything, especially for Portugal. They now had a real contender on their hands. Still, in 1493, Spain sponsored Columbus's second voyage, which was also unsuccessful. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty basically had them agree to split the world in two. So Spain would have gotten one half, which was the New World, and Portugal got a next half, which was the Old World. In 1498, infamous Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama became the first one to successfully sail around Africa to get to Asia, where he docked in India. Columbus's encounter with the New World marked the first encounter for any European, and it sparked centuries of exploration, and it led to the rise of the Spanish Empire, who would eventually overtake Portugal as a European superpower. However, let's take a second to get something straight. Columbus did not discover any of these new lands or countries that were considered the New World. Why? Because there were already people living there. Can you guess who? Yep, the Amerindians. And in 1498, Columbus stumbled upon our beautiful island of Trinidad, where he and his crew encountered our first people. So, the question is, what happened when the first people met the second people? Well, stay tuned to the next episode to find out. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and catch you next time on Sweet TNT.